Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Post Intelligence Weekly Briefing. Every Friday, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders from various key sectors for a single purpose: to get smarter faster. I'm Louisa Savage, Editorial Director of Washington Post Intelligence, and if this is your first time joining us, welcome. WP Intelligence is a new kind of media. It's built for executives and policymakers who need insight to help them see around corners of policy and industry trends. Our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and healthcare. We have a graphics library, exclusive interviews, and these live briefings where we sort out developments that are changing the business and policy landscape. Today, we're digging into the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act. This is one of the largest and most consequential defense packages in recent history. It's a 3,000-page bill worth $900 billion of funding that touches nearly every corner of national security: military pay, nuclear modernization, space resilience, border deployments, defense industrial expansion, and sweeping reforms to accelerate defense acquisition. And today we're going to discuss the implications of this bill for business and industry and some of the major shifts that have been signaled in this bill toward faster technology adoption, hardened supply chains, and more assertive positioning against China and other adversaries. So we're going to take a lot of questions today because we want to be as useful to you as possible. To unpack this very high stakes topic, we are joined by two people who've been analyzing this legislation very closely. Josh Rogin is our lead global security analyst, and he's been covering not only the NDAA, but the broader evolution of the defense sector and how the Pentagon is overhauling its interactions with private industry, particularly the growing role of Silicon Valley in defense contracting. Welcome, Josh.
Glad to be with you all.
And Michael Sobolik is Senior Fellow in Foreign Relations at the Hudson Institute and author of the book Countering China's Great Game. He focuses on U.S.-China strategic competition with a focus on AI, and he is a former legislative aide to Senator Ted Cruz, where he worked on U.S.-China policy, North Korea, and other Indo-Pacific issues. Thank you so much for being with us, Michael.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. Well, so here's how we'll organize the conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to talk about a major transformation in defense acquisition that this legislation aspires to achieve. Second, we'll talk about some of the provisions in the legislation that are aimed specifically at countering China, as well as some even tougher provisions that did not make it into the final bill. We'll also talk about what the bill does around strengthening supply chains, beefing up research and innovation, as well as specific systems such as the Golden Dome, space, and missile defense. And third, we'll touch on a topic that we've previously covered in depth that also has implications for business, and that is the resolution of the congressional fight over reauthorizing and modernizing the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, reinforcing its role as a national security tool for competing with China in strategic regions and strategic sectors. So as always, we'll be talking about how business leaders and policymakers can navigate this moment. And I'd like to thank the audience for all the questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing, and I've used them to help shape the conversation as usual. Throughout the conversation, I invite you to drop your questions and comments into the Q&A tab, and we will take relevant questions as we go along. I have an iPad here on the desk, and I'll see what you're all sending in and try to work it in as we go. So let's get into it. Josh, you published a report on our platform yesterday, the Pentagon's new operating system inside the NDAA, and you took a look at some of the very significant aspects of the NDAA and its implications for business. And you wrote that the level of spending increase is actually pretty modest, but the big story is this legislation's attempt to fundamentally reshape how the Pentagon develops and acquires weapons. So walk us through what it does.
Sure. Well, every December, just before they leave town for the winter break, the Congress somehow manages to get its act together and pass this one bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. And because it's a must-pass bill, it becomes a vehicle for all sorts of defense and also non-defense related items. there's a lot of policy items that are in this bill. There are a lot of international affairs items in this bill. There's a repeal of sanctions against Syria. There's legislation to tighten outbound investment on China. And then there's the Pentagon budget, which is now over $900 billion, the largest ever. And inside of that budget, there are authorizations for a whole host of initiatives and that was coordinated very closely with the administration. And what my report focused on was what I call the most ambitious plan to reform the defense acquisitions and procurement system in decades. And everybody knows what the problem is, and it's not a new problem. I'm old enough to remember when Secretary Donald Rumsfeld first introduced the idea of sort of capabilities-based development. In other words, instead of building huge platforms that we decide what it's going to be, and then it takes 3 years to figure out how to build it, and then 10 years to build it. We have to be constantly developing and building and innovating in order to keep pace with technology. And that's something that the Pentagon's been trying to do for a long time. Now this is their latest attempt. And the other big piece of this is using commercial off-the-shelf technology whenever you can. And that is, again, not a new idea, but seems really important now that we have a situation where our main competitor, China, is innovating and scaling at least as fast, and in some cases faster than us. And we can't do it all through the government and government contractors and the traditional primes. So there's an urgent need to not only find the best commercial technology and figure out how to use it for our military, but also to open up the aperture of defense spending to a lot of new companies. And the good news is that a lot of those companies, especially technology companies, after a very long time have decided to head directly into the defense business in new and interesting ways. So this legislation, along with the administration's executive orders and the guidance coming out of the Department of Defense, are all aimed at finally tackling this very big and very urgent and very complicated problem. And I think that's all pretty much bipartisan in terms of who supports it. But the question is whether or not they'll actually be able to execute in an environment marked by chaos and disruption.
Well, let's bounce off of that, Michael. Josh's report cites a study from your think tank, the Hudson Institute, showing that it takes more than 2.5 years for the Pentagon to just validate requirements for a new defense program. Can you talk a little bit about some of the issues of the current system and how this legislation is aiming to fix that?
Of course. I had a lot of memories flood when I was reading through this legislation, when I was working for Senator Cruz, when Josh mentioned the breakdown of you have the foreign affairs piece, then you have the Pentagon piece, and then you have other boutique systems. During the 5 years I worked for the senator, he was on the Senate Armed Services Committee for most of that time, and I did a lot of his foreign affairs work. But of course, I was in the room for all the conversations about the Pentagon ledger as well. And Josh is right. The acquisition side of this is a tale as old as time in terms of a problem that DC has been aware of. But now there's an urgency to do something about it. And one of the biggest problems with our acquisitions program has been not only defined by a top-down model that's rigid, but it's defined by paperwork where it can take upwards of 2.5 years just to approve a requirement and validate it before you even get into development of the platform that is meant to service the requirement. It is a bloated system that America has been able to get away with because let's face it, when we were facing down the war on terror and foreign terrorist organizations, the asymmetry that we had between our high tech, high end capabilities and the lower end ones of terrorists, like we had the luxury of being able to be inefficient with acquisitions. And if it took a long time to get from approval of a need to the development and the testing and the deployment of one, we were able to more or less live with that. But now, in this age of renewed great power competition, and as Josh said, with the People's Liberation Army in China being able to scale as quickly as they can, we just don't have that luxury anymore. So one of the biggest things that this reform does, it takes a lot of the authority and like the practical authorization and testing of these acquisition platforms away from the high-end DoD board and empowers it with these portfolio managers. And the point is to get these needs approved down from a matter of years to a matter of months, like think 3 months to 6 months. And then coupling that with pilot programs that can quickly develop what this could look like, test it quickly, refine it. They want to be nimble and fast. And the commercial off the shelf element that Josh mentioned is also key because if you look at something like shipbuilding, we are getting outclassed by China by orders of magnitude. And drones, which I think we may get into later on in this conversation, is going to be one of the most important platforms, and China controls those supply chains by and large. So they want to diffuse the authority for acquisitions down to the people that can be making these decisions faster, more rapidly, and to be able to assemble prototypes for testing much faster than we have been previously. It's bold, it's ambitious, it's in the exact right direction of where we need to be going, and now it's all about execution.
Mhm. Josh, you're nodding. We've talked a lot in these briefings about the Pentagon's changing relationship with the private sector, which Michael just alluded to, particularly with technology companies. And you write in your report that the new approach is meant to be commercial first. So, what exactly does commercial first mean?
Right. It can mean a bunch of different things. One thing that it means is that if there is a commercial technology that can solve a problem, then the mandate for these Pentagon acquisitions people is to choose that one first. Don't build something if it already exists. And that's really complicated because the way that the government works, that's not really how it's always been designed in terms of a procurement and budgeting standpoint. So changing the incentives to allow that adoption of commercial technology, which for national security purposes and building the systems to do that, that's an ambitious thing. Again, not a new idea, but a good idea. And then the second thing is to bring new entrants into the field. You have basically the traditional defense contractors, the large primes like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and all of them, and they still command a lot. The vast majority. I don't know what it is, but like a huge percentage of the procurement and acquisitions and research and development dollars. And a tiny percentage, but growing percentage, is held by new entrants like Palantir, Anduril, and SpaceX. And then there's 20 or 30 other companies that are tech companies or research companies that are trying to break into this business with varying levels of success. And they can do it either by opening up the aperture to these companies to get them onboarded into the system faster. Or they can do what Michael said, which is put the power to make these decisions closer to those companies. And then what they mean by sort of capability acquisitions is that rather than saying we know we want platform X in 20 years, you develop the best capability of each component, and then like for the best tires, the best widgets, the best transistors, the best glass, the best lasers. And then once you're doing that, you can apply those across different programs. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel quite literally every time you build something that has a wheel in it. And so all of that is to sort of, shift the sort of focus, not to that the old primes are going to go away. They're still going to have the majority of the business as far as the eye can see. But even if you get 1%, 5%, 10% of $1 trillion budget, it starts adding up to real money. And you have a lot of people inside the Pentagon now who come from that ecosystem and who come from the private sector, and they're trying to, figure out how to make all of that work. But it's easier said than done.
Michael, you mentioned this earlier that the legislation creates a new position, portfolio acquisition executive. What is that? Why does it matter? And what does it change?
So these individuals are going to be running point on something that higher ups in the bureaucratic chain of command previously had their finger on. For a long time, DoD handled these acquisitions through an empowered board that not only had the strategic vantage point of saying what are the threats that we have, what are broadly speaking the capabilities we need, but they also had their hands into the tactical nitty-gritty of what the specific requirements were, what the platforms should look like in a design feature to respond to them. And that was one of the reasons why we've had such delayed acquisitions, because if you have a bureaucracy that high up getting into the nitty gritty of defense platforms, you have the follow on tail of paperwork that follows it. And when we talk about bureaucracy delaying acquisitions, what we are really talking about are a series of paperwork requirements upon paperwork requirements just to approve a need, just to approve just to validate that we need something to respond to this threat. And then and only then can you get into a competitive bid to build the thing. So these portfolio managers are further down the bureaucratic chain, and they are the ones who will be empowered with that tactical assessment of what are the actual capabilities and the technical details that will matter either in like the UAV space and the drone space and the cyberspace. If we're talking about army platforms, navy platforms, like you still have that higher end bureaucratic element at the strategic level that's going to try to harmonize these needs across the services. But really, the big thing that we need to be able to do is to approve needs and to build prototypes and test them quickly. We need to reduce this space of identifying a potential need to deploying something where by the time it's actually deployed, the threat has changed. And I think that is the thing that both Josh and I are kind of trying to get at. By the time the DoD or Department of War is able to finally deploy a platform, the very threat that it was meant to respond to has morphed and changed because, of course, war is always changing and threats are always changing. So these portfolio managers are being empowered to reduce that space to something that is on the short matter of months. That then we will be able to have a much quicker iterative reaction to threats and deploying platforms, and we're not behind the eight ball constantly.
That's so interesting. And Josh, you had a really striking chart in your report that we're going to show on screen. Um, the budget went up somewhat, but there were cuts. And talk us through where those cuts are. I think it sort of reflects what Michael was just saying.
Sure. Well, as you can see, a lot of the broad accounts for how we fund the military are roughly the same. You'll see two big differences in this chart. One is personnel and health are going up, that we have a single payer health system in the military, and it's expensive. Health care costs are rising. And the other one is the procurement budget is going down, a drop of almost 9% from last year's authorization. And, it makes you wonder, how are we going to do all of this reform and all of this change and all this procurement and ramp up our ability to have an acquisition system that moves faster with less money. And in one sense, it's a contradiction, and in the other sense, the explanation is that they're trying to build efficiencies into the system, and the efficiencies can theoretically create opportunities for savings. But you could see where that could go wrong because you're going to need a lot of people. And what the Department of Defense is doing is they're cutting the civilian workforce, just like every other department in the government, under the theory that they should have more people with lethality, people with guns in their hands and missiles at their fingertips than people doing paperwork. And again, not a new idea. Tooth to tail ratio has been, again, debated for decades. But now they're going to have to do with a little less money. And I think that could be a challenge to the implementation and execution. And I think you see that across the government, where you have all of these ambitious ideas in all of these national security departments, and then they're firing off half the people that are supposed to implement them. And I don't think that there's a really clear explanation for how to square all of that, but they want to save money and do a huge reform effort at the same time. Well, let's see what happens.
Michael, Josh is talking about some of the challenges, and we have a question coming in from an audience member about another potential challenge. How significant of a barrier to the innovations discussed by the panelists is vested interest in the status quo by powerful actors, for example, existing traditional defense contractors?
Great question. It's going to be an issue. And interestingly, the chief operating officer at Palantir, Sham Shankar, was at Hudson Institute for an AI conference that we hosted recently. He is one of our trustees at Hudson. And this came up in the panel that he was on about AI and defense. And there's going to be this delicate balancing act where we're trying to open and expand the aperture of the types of partners that the Department of War has. And the vested interests, the primes in particular, clearly have their own interests that will encounter some awkwardness with this new direction that the department is taking. And let's also face it, in some of these platforms, you're going to need to have different responses depending on what the need is and what the threat is. In some cases, having an open competition between primes and new entrants and smaller ones to make sure that we get the capability that we need quickly, especially if we don't know all of the intricacies yet, that's going to be a good thing. And in other cases, there's going to have to be a lot more direct guidance from these portfolio managers in particular about if we waste too much time on the front end, we're actually going to get even further behind. So we need to take a calculated risk and pick a winner now and move fast. And this is where, when I said earlier, it all comes down to execution. Leadership here is something you cannot take out of the equation, not just at the highest levels of the department, but even in the mid-tier bureaucracy. Because if this model is to have empowered portfolio managers to oversee these considerations, then you are going to need to have people making tough judgment calls about how sustained and how open or how defined this competition is going to be. And of course, you're going to have primes pushing their own interests, and you're going to have new entrants doing the same. The North Star here needs to be putting the US military on a war footing that can deter foreign adversaries right now and in the next 2, 3 years, and 5 years. uh, the guiding light here. We've talked about the quote unquote Davidson window for a long time. Former Admiral Davidson talked about the People's Liberation Army being ready to move on Taiwan by 2027 per instructions from Xi Jinping. That's a pretty good indicator for us about where the DoD, old habits die hard, the Department of War needs to be, and 2027 is not that far. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that China is going to move in 2027, but the PLA needs to be ready to do so by then. So the North Star cannot be awarding special favors either to primes or to new entrants. The North Star has to be a war footing that is capable of deterring. So these portfolio managers and undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, uh, up to and including, of course, the secretary, but like the mid tier, they are going to need to make some calculated risks. And Congress, I think if we really want this to change, Congress is going to have some appetite and willingness to let this risk taking happen. And if we have some failures along the way, uh, I think our posture should at least be viewing those failures the same way we view the failure on a missile defense test. You missed now, but we would rather you miss now instead of missing in a crisis. So more
Hmm.
testing is actually good and not bad. So it's
Right.
going to be a balancing
A
act.
filter change, right?
Yeah,
Sorry, Josh, you want to
just
add something, and then I have some drone questions from the audience.
yeah, just very quickly on the fate of our prime contractors. Listen, they're not stupid. They're taking various measures to adjust to the new reality and the new environment, and they have a lot of advantages. And first of all, a lot of those legacy platforms will continue anyway. Second of all, I think a lot of the new entrants, rather than trying to replace the primes are partnering with them. So the companies, smaller companies like Divergent, a 3D printing company that we wrote about out of LA, they just want to be subcontractors to all the primes, and they don't need to replace the primes in order to have a great business. And it's great for the primes too, even as they try to innovate inside of their own organization. So I think you'll see a bunch of different approaches. I think systems integration will become a huge focus of the primes because that's where they have sort of the human technical advantage over some of the new entrants. And somehow everybody will make their yearly quota. I predict.
All right. Well, we have the following questions about drones. I'm going to just read them all and then let you guys jump in. Is there a proper recognition of the role drones now play in warfare and resources to meet that challenge? Does this cover innovations like low-cost drones, air and water? Are we moving fast enough into the new era of drone warfare? And what is being cut to get there? Does the new NDAA change the trajectory of development for agentic AI or autonomous weapons system? How is the military transitioning toward more drone and autonomous devices from conventional larger manned platforms, and who's doing the R&D? The bill envisions new fighters and bombers. Do drones potentially make such investments obsolete? So maybe Michael, I'll go to you and then Josh.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about there, but I'll pick up on that final one, and then maybe we can dig into the specific of drones from there. No, drones are not going to replace these legacy platforms. And there's at least one obvious reason why. The one competitive advantage with drones is that they are small and difficult to detect, or at least in theory, hopefully. And even if you can detect them, if you send a swarm in, then maybe that makes it difficult to address it. But with strategic bombers, the whole point of a bomber, depending on how you want to use it, is to signal. In many cases, you want the bomber to be seen and for your adversary to know that it's there. And if you look at the triad, that is one of the core purposes it serves. The subs and the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Submarine Force with our tridents, those are meant to be concealed because you always want to keep your enemies guessing about where that sea-based nuclear capability is. But with these bombers, you want them to be able to travel a very, very long time for extended missions, and they can refuel in air, of course. But you kind of want the adversary to know that they're there for signaling and for deterrence. And you also saw the role that they played in conventional munitions this summer with Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran. There's no way we could have performed that mission with drones. The only plane that could have done that was the B-2. So, no, like, drones are not going to replace legacy platforms, but as we are already seeing in Ukraine, you can't grapple with not just the future of warfare, but the here and now of warfare without drones. And the final vignette I'll say here to bring this full circle, look at what Ukraine did inside of Russia. They pre-deployed drones and attacked what? The bomber fleets of Russia's Air Force. So no, they're not going to replace them, but drones are asymmetric and they can target more expensive, more strategic platforms while also changing the battlefield. So there's a lot to talk about here, but both of these will survive into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Josh?
Yeah, I agree with that. Let me take you a little bit deeper into what the bill actually does, because there's a lot of drone stuff in the bill. And it basically tries to establish a regime of authorities and permissions and structures that will accelerate the drone and also counter drone systems, which is a huge, huge thing. There's going to be a new joint interagency task force that's going to sort of establish both the drone and the counter drone programs as core missions, and that'll give them additional focus and attention. The bill explicitly addresses the idea of protecting U.S. military installations all over the world from drone incursions, which is an expanding problem. It funds drone development, but not just drones like in the regular sense, but what we call the CCA, the Cooperative Combat Aircraft, which is essentially going to be some sort of fighter jet drone that's going to operate in swarms somehow. I don't know. We'll see if that happens. But anyways, they're funding it. Then it has a lot of stuff about sensors. A lot of the problems with the drones is that, it's hard to get the data and the reliability, and that requires a lot of integrating commercial sensors and commercial information streams with military information streams, very complicated stuff. And that's all in there too. So basically what you're seeing is that, the bill aims to rapidly expand and raise the priority of drone and counter drone systems. Again, very ambitious. We'll see what actually happens. And then on AI, I think it's a little bit separate actually, because this is more in the our research development and evaluation part of the budget, and involves more of the research organizations like the Defense Innovation University and DARPA and ARPA and all of those things. And what they're trying to create is it's a different approach where they're trying to create experimental environments for integrating commercial AI developments into military applications. And the way that they do that is basically by building, what they're going to propose doing is building these, what they call sandboxes. And then you invite everybody to play in the sandbox, and you establish some sort of development fund with an AI company like OpenAI or Palantir or whatever. And there are a bunch of these. And you just throw a bunch of money in the sandbox, and then you see what happens, which is again, probably a very good idea, but the devil will be in the details.
Hmm. Well, let's move to China. The NDAA includes two major pieces of new legislation related to China. The first is a new regime to monitor and restrict the ability of U.S. entities to invest money in Chinese companies that could advance Chinese military capabilities against our own. What is new here, Josh? It's something you cover a lot.
Right. Well, there are two new things. One is that uh, the Congress actually passed the first ever restrictions on outbound U.S. investment into Chinese companies of concern, and this has been something that the Congress has been working on for years, and it never worked. And even last year, it was about to pass, and somehow it didn't pass. And basically, the idea here is that U.S. investors shouldn't be giving U.S. money to Chinese companies that are going to help the Chinese military build the machine that's pointed against us. Right? If you think about it, it should be kind of obvious. They're building a military technology regime again to harm us, and we shouldn't fund that. In theory, that's the theory. But on the other hand, you have a lot of Wall Street guys who have been doing just that for 30 years. So this is the first real attempt to rein some of that in, and this is kind of like a generational shift. We have a screening for Chinese investments in the United States under the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. So that's one thing. This is the other direction. And so any company in China, theoretically, under the military fusion strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, is obligated to help the Chinese military with whatever they can all the time. It's not like they can say no. So that could be a very, very big deal if it's implemented a certain way, or it could be very narrowly construed. And I think now that the legislation has been passed, we'll have to see whether the administration implements it seriously, because there's a lot of pushback from Wall Street, from Chinese Communist Party, from it could get wrapped up in the trade deal if Trump ever finds out about it. Maybe he's watching this and he will find out about it, in which case we might have changed the story, but that's neither here nor there. And then the other thing is the Biosecure Act. This is a similarly, intentioned effort to stop U.S. biotech companies from helping Chinese biotech companies, or at least relying on Chinese biotech companies, because Chinese biotech companies are connected to the Chinese military, and if they beat U.S. biotech companies, that's really bad, not just for U.S. biotech industry, but for our national security, because you just imagine what the Chinese Communist Party would do with the best biotech in the world. It's pretty scary stuff. I referenced to you the pandemic of 2019 as a preview of just what the possibilities of what could happen if, the ability to manipulate biology redounds to the benefit of our adversary. And so this bill tries to restrict that. Now, again, the devil's in the details. What it doesn't do is make a list of companies that are going to be prohibited. There's no list in the bill because, Big Pharma was very much against that. So they, American biotech lobbied against, this because they want to do business with China, and they depend on China for the supply chain. So it's complicated. But what's going to happen next year, according to my sources, is that the Pentagon is going to issue a list of these biotech companies that are now restricted under the new law, and big Chinese companies are going to be on that list. Surprise, spoiler alert. And that was the plan, to sort of get the legislation through Congress without directly calling out these Chinese companies, but everybody knows what the companies of concern are. And then when the Pentagon comes out with its list, unless some, mishigas happens between now and then, these Chinese companies are going to be barred from doing business that's related to U.S. government business. There can be other restrictions, and that won't be the end of the saga, but it's again the beginning of I think a long discussed effort to maybe not help America's greatest adversary dominate biotech, which doesn't seem like a great idea.
So, Michael, Josh has talked about a few restrictions on China that made it into the bill. There are also other ideas that went even further that did not make it into the bill. Do you want to talk just very briefly about what those were, including in the areas of research, microchips?
Yes, of course. So the big, most notable provision that also garnered the most media attention that ultimately did not make it into the NDAA was the Gain AI Act. And this gets to the epicenter of US-China tech competition with artificial intelligence and with chips specifically. So there are two competing theories in Washington about how America beats China with AI. On the one hand, you have Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, and David Sachs, the AI czar in the White House, making this case that America needs to diffuse our tech stack globally to make sure that any AI integration and deployment at the societal economic level is being done on US cloud services, on US AI models, uh, and powered by US semiconductors, chips. And that's all well and good. And myself, as someone who is more concerned by national security issues, I think a lot of us in the national security community agree with that. But then on the other hand, if you are empowering adversaries with the exporting of parts of the US tech stack, then you're essentially doing the very problem that this outbound investment thing that Josh just talked about is trying to solve, which is, not to put too fine a point on it, funding your own destruction or equipping your adversary to affect your own destruction. And the reality is China is years and generations behind American competitors on chips for AI. So what myself and many others in DC have been arguing is the best way to keep China behind in AI is to not equip them with AI chips, as simple as that may sound. But this came to a head in the Defense Authorization Act because there was legislation from Senator Banks and from Chairman Mast in the House to simply ensure that if NVIDIA or any other company wanted to export chips to China, that they first needed to fulfill purchasing orders from American companies, which I think makes sense. If you want to sell chips abroad, especially to foreign adversaries, you got to make sure that our own American AI companies get what they need for AI compute first. That went through a number of different revisions for political negotiations. The final draft, which nearly made it in but did not, switched some of those requirements and basically empowered Congress to have a review period for chip exports in the same way that they have a review period for arms exports. And while that did not make it into the NDAA, primarily because of advocacy from Jensen Huang and NVIDIA, and also White House opposition from David Sachs specifically, Chairman Mast, I think just earlier today, reintroduced a version of that legislation that I fully expect will be another congressional fight next year. So that fight is not done, but that's how it resolved for NDAA. Quickly on research issues, higher education has long been allergic to disclosing its relationships or any kind of foreign funding from foreign adversary countries, China first and foremost. And Congress, I remember when I was a staffer and I did this, we always tried to get higher ed to live up to their disclosure requirements on foreign gifts and on the types of exchange relationships they had with universities and foreign adversary countries. They rely on foreign money and foreign student tuition in a significant way. So they were always hesitant and they were always resistant. And it happened again with the NDAA. So there was a very big provision that did not make it, primarily because of university lobbying and from members of Congress who are, in my editorialization, beholden to some of those interests. But my expectation is that with China policy, the rhythm we have is a big idea, it gets pushed for 2 or 3 years, it continually meets opposition. But then eventually the momentum due to the threat from China is too great that eventually the dam breaks and it'll go through. Sooner or later, these revisions and these types of policies will get implemented. The question is how quickly and can we be competitive enough to get them implemented quickly enough? So we'll see.
Josh, talk about some of what the bill means for some of the big spending areas like the Golden Dome, like space. What's the big picture here on those initiatives?
Right. Well, what it does is it puts into law a lot of the Trump administration, the White House's executive orders related to specific things, and not just Golden Dome. I mean, there's a whole bunch of executive orders that about securing our borders, about using the military domestically for law enforcement, getting rid of DEI, all that kind of stuff. But in there was also executive orders about building the Golden Dome for America, which is designed to be a giant missile shield that covers the continental United States, which I don't think will ever really exist. But the point is that once you put it into law, it drives a bunch of actors inside the system to start not just building things that would go into it, but changing all of the things that they're building to make it into a Golden Dome. So if you were building a missile, now it's a Golden Dome missile. If you were building a widget, now it's a Golden Dome widget. And so it just focuses everything. And same thing for nuclear reactor technologies. There's an executive order. We definitely need better nuclear reactors. and more of them. I think that's pretty bipartisan, not to put aside the safety concerns in that endeavor, but you get my point. The White House can say anything it wants, but once it's in law, then all of a sudden the system can really sort of start to respond. And there's another one on drone dominance, which is, again, the administration's policy. So I think a lot of the questions about a lot of the defense reforms is what happens when Trump leaves, assuming he leaves, and what happens if the Congress turns Democrat in 2027. And so by getting these things into the law now, it gives them a much higher chance of surviving those two possibilities. And again, it doesn't mean that we're going to have a missile shield called the Golden Dome anytime soon. It just means that, for the next 3 years or so, there's going to be a lot of momentum and focus and money poured into that system. So that could have all sorts of spin-off effects for all the technologies, mostly in space. And if you look at the Golden Dome system, the way it's been announced, you could take a huge basket of technologies that are basically our existing missile defense. Then you wipe off missile defense, you write Golden Dome on them. But the new stuff is all in space. And that's why the Golden Dome is managed by the Space Force. I think this NDAA definitely codifies the rising influence and power and authority of the Space Force, which is another big Trump thing. And it doesn't tell you where we're going to end up, but it tells you what direction we're headed in, and that's something.
Interesting. There's an audience question I'll kick to you, Michael. There's a funding freeze for the proposed reorganization of military regional commands until the Pentagon reports on its costs and risks. If that plan is eventually approved and implemented, how will it affect the DoD's, or I guess DOW's, annual budget and expenditures as specified in the NDAA?
I'm sorry, costs and risks in reference to Golden Dome or in reference to something
All right,
else?
no, this is the proposed reorganization of military regional commands.
Oh, the reorganization. I I have a few simple thoughts on that. Congress does these moves all the time. I'm so unsurprised that they're withholding funding. I think that's good for Article One health. But Josh can probably speak to those details better than I can. But just suffice it to say, this is not abnormal for Congress to do something like that. But I'll let Josh handle the specifics.
Yeah, so I've got some new exclusive reporting for our webinar that I got at a holiday party the other night from sources in the know. Okay, so this is breaking. And basically what happened was, as the Washington Post first reported, the Pentagon is proposing to totally reorganize the structure of American overseas commands. And essentially what they're going to do is they're going to subordinate the combatant commanders, the four-star admirals and generals who run these combatant commands like CENTCOM, PACOM, AFRICOM, et cetera, underneath the Joint Staff for the purpose of operational deployment. And that means that right now, if you want to deploy troops, you got to get the combatant commander's permission. Now, it's going to be up to the Joint Staff now. And so that's a consolidation of power inside the Joint Staff and a really operationalization of the Joint Staff in a new way that never existed before, because the Joint Staff is supposed to be advisors. They're not actually in the chain of command, but now they're going to have all these new powers. Now, what I learned recently is that this proposal, which is now making its way through the Pentagon, now faces a new series of challenges and negotiations, both with the White House and then with Congress. And the idea is to refine it over the course of the next 6 months in order to get it into the next NDAA. So this is something that will not happen until the next, because it needs some sort of legislative action in order to really happen. And so it's likely that this will change and then change again. And from the combatant commander's perspective, what they're lobbying for inside the system is not against it altogether, but just to say that they want to have the forces that are assigned to them continue to be assigned to them, even if they're relinquishing some control. Because the second phase of the reorganization that is being rumored inside the Pentagon, but has not yet been announced, is broad withdrawals, large withdrawals of U.S. forces overseas, the rolling up of bases in Europe, even in Asia. And again, this is pre-decisional, so I'm just giving you the scuttlebutt. But what the commanders in the field are worried about, more than the Joint Chiefs being able to sort of operationalize their forces, is that they get their forces taken away from them. And if you have 28,000 troops in South Korea, and next day you have 20, well, that's a much, much bigger deal. So this is a huge initiative by the Secretary of Defense, who I still call the Secretary of Defense because if you notice, the bill did not change the name of the Department of Defense. So legally, it's still the Department of Defense. So that's what I'm going to call it. And this is a fight that's just beginning. And I think that it has huge implications for how we organize our military and our alliances with all of these countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany, you name it. And as you can imagine, I'm sure they're all watching that with a lot of trepidation.
Well, Josh, you touch on an issue that is really more about the overall U.S. posture, right? And we've had a couple kind of big picture questions that I'd like to throw to both of you. They're kind of connected. One is there an effort to promote peace rather than prepare for war? I realize this is a defense act, but the goal is not to have a war, but to maintain peace. As someone else was also asking, are there any dollars in this huge bill dedicated to peace promotion and dialogue? And then another person is asking what is sort of the basis for calling China an adversary? What is the actual threat from China? So if you could sort of elaborate on that bigger picture.
Happy to
Yeah.
jump into that briefly. Sorry, go ahead,
Go
Josh.
ahead. No. I was just going to, reference a quote by a guy by the name of George Washington. And what he said, which I think applies here, is, quote, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving peace." So in other words, the entire point of the whole thing is to preserve peace. Like everything you buy, all the deterrents, all of the armaments are meant to establish a situation where nobody would attack the United States or its interests because we have overwhelming ability to defeat them. That's the essential argument of peace through strength. And now that's been confused in the current conversation by President of the United States, who and some of the people in the White House and in his administration who have a view that maybe American deployments and involvement and alliances are provocative and not stabilizing. I disagree with that. I think that the network of alliances like NATO and Japan and stuff has been good for peace. No one's attacked NATO in 80 years. We should probably think about that. Ukraine didn't have assurances and they got attacked, so that was more war. But if you're Trump, maybe you think, oh, well, maybe if we just pull up stakes and have the Don Roe doctrine and then just worry about the Western Hemisphere and let the rest of the world fend for itself, maybe that will result in peace. And I don't think that's what the data shows. I don't think that's what history shows. So if you're asking, like, does the bill promote peace? Well, that depends on what you think promoting peace is all about. Do you think promoting peace is about having the strongest country in the world so no one screws with us? Or do you think it's about rolling up the American worldwide project and hiding behind some walls and declaring Fortress America and letting everyone else just fend for themselves? I don't think the latter is going to result in peace, but apparently the President of the United States disagrees with that.
Mm-hmm. Michael, do you want to just address the China, why you are talking about China as an adversary? Does the bill talk about China as an adversary and what that's based on, but just very briefly?
Yes, briefly. So China has been legally in the US Code defined as an adversary for a long time in Title 10 of the US Code, along with Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So it's not bombastic or odd to speak of the People's Republic of China in that way. Legally, it is defined in the US Code as an adversary. And I think we think about peace and war very differently from China. Americans in our strategic culture tend to have this very bright line and bright division between wartime and peacetime. And our history bears that out. We tend to be historically in the 20th century very hesitant to enter war. But then once we are mobilized, we are quite dangerous. And then we fight quite aggressively. And then we reap a peace dividend and we draw down. That's not how the Chinese Communist Party thinks about warfare. It's much more fluid, it's much more gray, and they operate much more in the space of political warfare. So when you talk about the Chinese Communist Party control of social media apps in the US on TikTok for disinformation and discourse control, if you talk about the gray zone of what they did with building these fake islands in the South China Sea, that's not just because their construction companies need something to do to keep them busy. They are projecting power into international waters in a strategically vital spot on the map in the world. And if you look at their ambitions to subsume Taiwan, that's not just an internal issue for Taiwan. That impacts Japan's security, as we have seen viscerally in the news cycle with Chinese diplomats attacking Japan's prime minister recently. And we have a defense treaty with Japan. So China is a revisionist power. And Josh is right. The overriding US interest is in stability because we have accumulated a quite envious position in global power in the world, which I think is a good thing for American interests. China wants that. They want what America has, and they are a revisionist power trying to redraw not just how the map looks, but how the power dynamics look, which is why deterrence matters. If you want to prevent war from happening, you need to be strong enough and capable enough to do that.
All right. Well, I know we
I
could
would just
definitely
very
discuss
quick.
this all day, but I'm sorry, John, I do want to just touch on your report on the DFC. So this is another important thing that happened in the NDAA. And Josh, you had earlier published a report about the congressional struggle over the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. And this relates to this China conversation. So explain what the DFC is, why it was under dispute, and who's won this debate.
Sure. And I think it flows from the last question because, I think a lot of people are looking at this bill and they're like, okay, what does it do to promote peace and stability outside of funding the military? And it's true that the State Department authorization bill hasn't been passed in decades. And a lot of that stuff is either in this bill or just never legislated by Congress, like pretty much an abdication of their responsibility, in my opinion, to do that, to authorize what our diplomacy and development is going to be. And what the Trump administration did in its first year, objectively, is to burn our development infrastructure to the ground. The USAID, you name it, it's all gone, mostly, almost all gone. And what's that going to do for stability and peace? How can you have a policy of bringing stability to countries when you just removed all the aid and all of a sudden everyone's got to scramble or they're going to die? So that's definitely something that relates to the DFC, because the Trump administration's answer to that is, okay, well, we don't want to do USAID because for whatever reason, so we're going to put development in the hands of this agency called the Development Finance Corporation, and we're going to increase their lending authority to $200 billion. And that's going to be essentially their argument for replacing the development system that they just destroyed. And so, of course, everyone in the development world is looking at that and saying, okay, great, let's just do that. Fine. Okay, tell us what to do. And so inside the Congress, there was a big debate over this, because what the Trump administration wants to do essentially is to shift it from sort of humanitarian aid to more things that are related to national security, like supply chains and critical minerals. And then they want to shift it from being a donor organization to an organization that produces projects that have ROI and, that finance institutions can get excited about, that are going to build factories, and that can also have a good development effect, but it's just a different mindset. And so a lot of the Democrats, including House Foreign Affairs Chairman, ranking Democrat Gregory Meeks, insisted on preserving some of the Development Finance Corporation's original mission to help poor countries, not just to help countries that can help us, and to have more congressional oversight. And that was a sticking point for many months that we were reported on. And this bill resolves that by striking a compromise, frankly, between Democrats and Republicans, where a certain number of higher income countries can receive support, but the poor countries will still get a bunch of support. And then Congress will have a certain amount of oversight over these projects, but not as much as they would like and more than the administration originally wanted. So in that sense, it's an example of a compromise where neither side is 100% happy. But anyway, the Defense Finance Corporation is going to get reauthorized with this huge new mandate, and that's going to be a huge demand signal, both for aid organizations who just want to help poor people not be sick and have food and stuff and medicine, which I still think is a good thing, and then also for the companies and banks who want to speed up critical minerals factory in some country in the hopes that it will provide us with critical minerals, and then as a secondary or third effect, people might get some relief from their suffering.
Yeah. So just in the interest of time, I want to make sure we address some of our recommendations, because one of our missions here is to help decision makers navigate some of these issues. So Josh, walk us through. You've talked about the transformation in Pentagon procurement, research and development, innovation, and you've also talked about this new authority and money available to the Development Finance Corporation. So what are your top, takeaways for business decision makers, given what this bill does?
Yeah, I mean, basically my top line guidance is that these kinds of reform initiatives will definitely face bureaucratic and institutional pushback, lag. There's a high chance that these reforms will fail, but the opportunity is real because the momentum is there. So what businesses can do is to try to take advantage of the momentum to make these programs succeed, which will redound to their benefit before all that happens. So it really is a test of the next 6 to 12 months of how many of these 100 initiatives are really going to happen. And they're really going to happen if these companies can both sort of understand what this Pentagon staff is really focusing on by knowing the key players, like the Undersecretary Emil Michael and Michael Duffy and Stephen Feinberg, and what they're really focused on, and then come to them with viable, quick products that meet a warfighter need. And you look at a lot of these new tech companies, and the thing that they're really focused on is like, okay, it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be exquisite. The boat doesn't have to look nice. It just has to work. And if you can come to market with a technology that works, and then the right person to put it in front of, big things can happen for your company very fast that are also going to help the United States. But that window is not going to last forever because the machine always fights back.
Mm-hmm. Michael, what is your advice?
So Josh just talked about the defense side. I'll talk about the development side. If you look at the reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation and everything that Josh just sketched out, and you layer that with the language in the national security strategy that also was announced recently, you have a decent blueprint for what partnering with the government looks like. If you look at the areas of concern in the NSS, which is the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific, first and foremost, and then if you look at the rejiggering of the DFC, which allows and makes room for these more strategic partnerships in middle income to wealthier countries for supply chains, you have a decent roadmap for the kinds of projects that you could probably get interest for with the DFC. And listen, one of the biggest reasons that compromise was struck between development and more strategic supply chain development is because the United States is never going to have the scale that we need by ourselves to go up against China's Belt and Road Initiative in poor countries. We have been trying to do this for years and years. We've had limited success, but I can tell you from having literally written a book on this topic and from having met with embassies across Asia on this topic, we can't compete in a head-to-head fight in most cases. But if we can go to wealthier and middle-income countries that are more politically aligned with the United States, and if there's a supply chain mutual need that we both have to decouple or de-risk from China exposure, this is a huge open door for a lot of US companies or even just companies around the world who are interested in riding the wave. Look at the intersection of the NSS, look at the rejiggering of the DFC and the NDAA. And if you can play in that space, I think you'll have some interesting opportunities.
Excellent. Well, we always like to give people a look ahead. Josh, tell folks what you're working on next for subscribers.
Yeah, we're going to take a deep dive into the State Department's newest industrial initiative called Pax Silica. It was announced at the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace last week by our Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, Jacob Hellberg, who has a Silicon Valley background, and the idea is to build an alliance for supply chains for technology components and technology products that doesn't depend on China. Seems like a good idea, and we'll see how that goes. But we're going to take a look into how they're going to do it and what the opportunities and challenges are.
Excellent. And Michael, what's next for you?
I'm going to be digging into pharmaceutical supply chains pretty extensively next year. And if we saw what they did with critical minerals, they being China and export controls for rare earths, we do not want to see what they could do with pharmaceuticals. So I'll be doing a lot of work on that in 2026.
All right. Well, we'll have you back on that. That's a topic we've also been covering between our security and our healthcare verticals for sure. Well, thank you both so much. Obviously, big issue we'll continue to cover closely at WP Intelligence. And I'd like to remind our audience that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking the link on your screen. And starting in the new year, block your calendar for Fridays at 11 Eastern. That is our regular briefing slot. We will be off for the next 2 weeks for the holidays, but please join us on Friday, January 9th. I'll be back at our regular time with our lead energy and climate analyst, Catherine Clay, to discuss the year ahead in energy and energy policy and what's next for areas such as solar and fusion. which may be arriving sooner than we think. In the meantime, we'll send our audience a link to a recording of this briefing, and please take a moment to fill out the short post-briefing survey we send you. Your input shapes what comes next. Please have a wonderful weekend. We wish you very happy holidays, and we look forward to being with you in the new year.